Racist thugs. Shoot. Black man's sister. Unaware he is a ruthless Delta Force commander. They had no idea that the man they just provoked was the last kind of person a racist should ever mess with. A storm named Justice, once trained to annihilate the most lethal threats on this planet. Subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Lockridge County, Georgia, a town barely the size of a palm, with just around 3,200 residents, tucked between rows of pine forests and forgotten interstate routes. In this place, all roads seem to lead back to a single rundown gas station, Hanson's Gas, sitting alone between rusted pickup trucks. Its sign had long since peeled away, like the worn paint over the moral facade of its townsfolk. No cameras, no floodlights, and on that night, no justice. At around 8:17 p.m., a silver sedan slowly pulled into the station. Inside were a black couple, Malik and Ayanna, seniors at Georgia State University, heading home after an internship stint in Atlanta. They had just stepped out when a whistle pierced the air. 6 men, white, ranging from their 30s to 50s, closed in on them like they'd been waiting all along. One wore a red-brown flannel shirt with a sharply pointed goatee, later identified as Goatee, slapped the hood of the car and yelled, "You think you got the right to pump gas here, boy?" Another one flicked a beer can aside, voice slurred but laced with menace. "I can smell Harlem from 3 miles away." They laughed, drunken laughs steeped in self-appointed power. But that laughter froze the moment a black woman stepped forward, spine straight and eyes blazing. Joshua. 36 years old, an English teacher at Lockridge High School, recipient of the Educator of the Year. Award for her razor-sharp teaching methods and uncompromising spirit of resistance. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She simply stood tall, her voice ringing clear like a bell in the midnight dark. "Step back. They've done nothing wrong. You're just parading your cowardice in front of a town that's still asleep." Goatee scoffed and took a step closer. But then a large shadow emerged from behind the brick wall of the gas station. The night wind swept across an old khaki jacket, revealing an arm like steel and eyes that knew no fear. The eyes of someone who had seen death through a military scope, from the hills of Helmand to the mine-laced alleys of Ramadi. Abraham, Joshua's older brother, a former commander of Delta Force's Black Ops unit, assigned directly from the Pentagon, led missions with survival rates below 30%. He said nothing, just stood there. But that presence alone was enough to make the 6 men step back as their primal instincts screamed, this was not a man to provoke. Goatee stared at Abraham, didn't know his name, didn't know his rank, didn't know why his right shoulder hung slightly lower, an old grenade wound from Fallujah. But something in that gaze made him hesitate. There was no bloodshed that night, no fists thrown. However, that silence was not the end. It was a beginning. 36 hours later, at 11:12 p.m., gunshots rang out in Alley 12 on Rosewood Street. Joshua lay on the pavement, blood soaking the cracked sidewalk beneath her chest. In Abraham's arms, her eyes no longer held fire, only a peaceful kind of pain. One bullet. One life. One storm was beginning to brew, not in the sky, but inside a man who had once vowed never to lose another loved one to violence. And the shooter, the one who pulled the trigger, had unknowingly stepped on a mine. That mine was Abraham. And all of Lockridge would pay the price. The Greyhound bus from Savannah to Lockridge departed at 3:10 a.m., rolling through mist-covered low hills and abandoned cornfields, with only a few scattered passengers nodding off in sleep. In the last row, Abraham sat alone, his jacket shoulders faded, a baseball cap pulled low, his hand resting on an old backpack with a torn zipper corner. Inside were a few neatly folded clothes, a leather-bound notebook with a cracked spine, and the only thing still intact, his Delta Force medallion, never worn outside, but always kept close to his heart. When the bus stopped at the Lockridge station at 6:47 a.m., the morning mist had yet to lift. The station was nothing more than a small tin-roofed waiting room with a glitching digital sign blinking, "Welcome to Lockridge." No one waited there except Joshua. She stood quietly, wearing an earth-toned sweater, hair tied neatly at the nape, holding a steaming cup of coffee and a rolled-up newspaper. When Abraham stepped down, she approached, said nothing, and simply hugged him. A firm, lingering embrace, as though to stitch back the time that war had stolen. The coffee cooled, the newspaper fell to the ground, but they didn't say much. They didn't need to. Joshua drove her 2008 Ford Focus, the same car she used to shuttle her students, through town. Lockridge was no longer the place he had once grown up in. Old stores like Crawford's Garage and Hilda's Mini Mart were shuttered, their glass coated in dust, with crooked for-lease signs taped to the doors. The old bar, once a haunt for country-singing white patrons, now had a freshly hung Confederate flag, crimson and loud, like a wound left open. As they passed the main intersection, a group of young white men outside a car wash stared at Abraham through the window. One of them, around 20, wearing a hoodie with the words, "Reclaim the South," spat on the pavement, his eyes locked onto Abraham's. Joshua sighed. "I've gotten used to it. But ever since you came back, the stares feel different. They're afraid of you." They returned to the small house on the south side of town, the one they had both grown up in. One roof tile was missing, the back wall mottled with moss, but inside it was still tidy, still warm. A photo of their mother, Dolores, still hung over the fireplace, her gaze gentle but unyielding. Joshua boiled water, poured tea, and began telling him everything that had happened in the 4 years he was away. A 10th grade student was denied a spot on the debate team because her voice wasn't appropriate. A black colleague was reassigned to a low-performing school after confronting the principal. Joshua herself was once threatened with a lawsuit by a parent for teaching systemic racism during literature class. "I wrote to the school board 3 times. Every time they replied with silence," she said. "Lockridge hasn't changed. It's just better at hiding the rot." When night fell, Abraham stood on the porch, holding a cup of cold tea, his eyes staring off toward the northern tree line. Once the shooting range of their father, the man who stood watch between principle and sorrow. He had died from lung cancer, poisoned during his service in Panama. The streetlight flickered. A pickup truck drove by, slowing as it passed their house. The driver didn't look over, but Abraham knew that kind of movement. It wasn't accidental. Joshua stepped beside him, arms folded. "They're trying to figure out who you are. They don't know yet, but they're trying. And they don't like what they don't understand." Abraham nodded. "They don't need to understand. They just need to know. This time, no one's running anymore." Something had awakened deep inside him, not a rash anger, but the quietest, most dangerous feeling of all, clarity within righteous fury. The cracks in the homeland he once loved could no longer be patched. And this return was no longer about reunion. It was about reckoning. That afternoon, the setting sun poured across the warped porches of Lockridge, spilling over peeling walls as if stripping the town bare of its fake mask of peace. Joshua told Abraham she wanted to take a walk. "Just retracing old steps, brother," she said with a soft smile, though her eyes carried a quiet heaviness. The two walked silently through familiar streets. Rainwood Street, with the old Pie Corner Bakery that had closed down in 2019. Then the bumpy road behind the library, where they once rode bikes as children. As they neared Hanson's gas station, the sky turned a deep orange hue, the color of fire mingled with ash. It was right there, less than a mile from their home, that everything had once begun. And as if history were looping back on itself, they witnessed a scene that chilled their blood. A shiny black SUV, still new, with Atlanta plates, surrounded by 6 white men. They were dressed like before, flannel, old military jackets, even carrying chains and baseball bats. One of them jumped onto the hood and shouted through the window, "Wake up, you piece of trash! This ain't your land!" The woman inside recoiled, while the young man desperately tried calling the police. But the signal was weak, and the screen flickered with just 3 unstable bars. Joshua stepped forward without hesitation. "Joshua," Abraham called softly, moving as if to stop her. But she raised her hand, signaling him to hold. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. She walked beneath the faded yellow glow of the station lights, her shoes clicking against the pavement with a firm rhythm. When Joshua spoke, the whole group paused. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was cold as winter frost. "Take your hands off the car," she said, "or let this whole town see exactly who you are." One by one. The man with the goatee, tilted his head. He looked like a soul long decayed, feeding off the fear of others. He sneered, a twisted grin. "You must be really brave. Or real stupid." Abraham had stepped forward by then. Just one look from him, not aggressive, but precise like a laser locking onto its target, was enough to make the group hesitate. He didn't need to roar. It was his silence that unsettled them. Goatee stared back at him. Then he growled each word, like a venomous prophecy. "This ain't over." Abraham didn't reply, but his eyes had already memorized each face. Goatee with a scar on his right cheek, the shorter one with a coiled snake flag tattoo, the third wearing a keychain with the Southern Brotherhood logo. He knew how to observe, not out of fear, but for readiness. Joshua led the couple in the SUV away from the scene. The woman, trembling, whispered a thank you, tears streaming down her cheeks. The man, voice choked with emotion, managed only, "No one has ever done that for us before." That night, on the porch, Joshua sat still in the old rocking chair. Abraham stood beside her, gripping the rotting wooden railing tightly. "Next time," he said slowly, "they won't just bring threats." Joshua turned to him. "I know, but if no one stops them, this town will rot to its bones." Abraham didn't respond, but in his eyes, a light had begun to rise. Not hope, but preparation. He had faced death in the jungles of Sierra Leone, under artillery in Mosul, among mines in Fallujah. But the evil back home, with its Confederate flags, cheap beer, and smug glares, was far more terrifying, because it was allowed to exist, and it was growing by the day. Tomorrow, he knew, would no longer be about dialogue. It would be a battle, not just for survival, but to remind Lockridge that silence, too, is a crime. Lockridge sank into the night like it always did. Silent, stifling, lit only by scattered pale yellow glows from aging utility poles. But that night wasn't like other nights. It was thicker, as if something in the air was waiting to explode. Abraham sat on the porch, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the distant woods behind the town. After a simple dinner of red beans and white rice, Joshua said she wanted to stop by the school to pick up materials for Monday's lesson. "I can go by myself," she said with a soft smile, putting on her coat and grabbing an old canvas tote. But Abraham shook his head. "That's not happening," he said firmly. The two of them got in the car. The Ford Focus rolled through the dark streets with only the crunch of gravel under the tires and faint classical music playing from the radio, a song their father once loved. They didn't know they were being watched. At around 10:46 p.m., as the car passed Alley 12 on Rosewood Street, a narrow, seldom-used lane, often blocked by garbage trucks, a white F-150 pickup suddenly cut them off. Its headlights flared, blinding through the windshield. A second truck pressed in from behind, sealing off any escape. Abraham stepped out immediately, his movements sharp and instinctive. He scanned the surroundings, saw 4 figures emerging from the 2 trucks, all wearing hats and bandanas over their faces. He hadn't even called out to Joshua yet when a gunshot rang out. That sound, unlike the thousands he had heard in war zones, chilled him to the core. Not because of its volume, but because of where it landed. Joshua dropped like a thread suddenly cut. Abraham lunged toward her, his arms catching her blood-soaked body. The bullet had pierced her left chest, blood pooling in a dark puddle across the asphalt. Joshua didn't scream, didn't shake, only opened her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. "Joshua!" Abraham cried out. His voice tore through the night. He pressed his hand against her wound, trying to stem the bleeding, willing the impossible. But just seconds later, her body went still. Not a single movement. Police arrived just 7 minutes after the gunshot, but the first thing they did wasn't to look for the shooter, nor check on Joshua. 3 officers jumped out, heavily armed, guns aimed. "Hands where I can see them!" one of them shouted. Abraham raised his hands, his sleeves soaked with his sister's blood. Before he could say a word, he was slammed face first onto the hood of the car, cuffs clamped tightly around his wrists. "She's been shot. She needs medical help," he tried to yell, but no one listened. No questions about suspects. No one checked her pulse. Joshua lay there, her blood flowing under the streetlight, as if even her soul had been abandoned. At the Lockridge police station, Sheriff Clagg, a balding man in his 50s, with a voice dry as dust, looked at Abraham through the one-way mirror and spoke as if reading a weather report. "We're classifying this as mutual combat. No clear evidence, no cameras, no independent witnesses. Unless something changes, no one will be arrested." Abraham said nothing. What filled his mind wasn't grief. It was a calculation. He memorized the position of every vehicle, the sound of the shooter's engine, even the sweat-sour scent of the nearest officer's uniform. He had been trained to observe, to record, to miss nothing, not even a speck of dust. A young officer named Roddy glanced at Abraham, then quickly turned away. Perhaps his conscience wasn't entirely dead. But the rest, from Clagg to the 2 officers writing the report, seemed programmed to bury justice with every word they typed. That night in the holding cell, Abraham sat motionless, like a carved statue. But the storm had already formed. No one knew, and no one realized, that the man they had just shackled was the only thing standing between them and the retribution approaching fast. No one, except him. And he had never missed a target. Joshua's funeral took place on a Saturday morning. It didn't rain, but thick gray clouds blanketed the cemetery on the south side of Lockridge. The small St. Vincent Church, where Joshua once hosted poetry readings for her students, was now packed to capacity. From the front rows to the back aisle, each person stood still, hands clasped, heads bowed. There were no camera shutters. No one spoke loudly. Not a single person looked away. More than 400 people attended. Former students came from as far as Macon, Albany, and even Savannah. A 14-year-old child stood trembling, holding a copy of a poem she had once handwritten corrections on. "You are the light. Don't let anyone dim it." A senior student stood next to the coffin, dressed in a black suit and worn-out sneakers, repeating, "She told me I could become a lawyer. I will." I swear Abraham sat in the middle pew, silent. The black suit he wore was the only one he owned, custom-tailored for his Distinguished Service Cross ceremony in 2012. His military shoes were polished to the point that they reflected the candlelight. He didn't bow his head, but he didn't look up either. His eyes had turned to stone. No tears, only depth. Father Matthew led the service, but the words that stole the breath from the room came from a 7th-grade girl, Layla, who stepped up and said through tears, "Ms. Joshua told us, don't wait for justice from others. Be the first justice in your classroom." As people slowly left the church, Abraham stood motionless beside his sister's portrait. In the photo, Joshua smiled, the light catching the exact moment her eyes sparked with wisdom and pride. He said nothing, but something cracked deep in his chest, not pain, but the roar of something that had been held back for far too long. That night, after the last guests had gone home, Abraham returned to Joshua's room. Everything was untouched, her lesson planner open on the desk, the lamp still faintly scented with lavender. But it was the message written in ink on the mirror that made his heart skip a beat. Justice does not arrive through bullets, but it never comes if no one acts. Joshua's handwriting, bold, slanted strokes. Abraham reached out and lightly touched the words, afraid they might vanish. He needed no further sign. In the days that followed, Abraham began a journey. Not the journey of a citizen seeking a courtroom, but the journey of a soldier tracking a target. He returned to the crime scene on Rosewood Street, measured the distance from the bullet's origin to where Joshua had fallen, noted the position of the trucks. From a single remaining shell casing, a Remington .308, he knew it wasn't from a regular handgun. Someone had used a high-caliber hunting rifle, fired from less than 15 meters away. Next, Abraham went to the auto shop where Goatee used to work. He didn't enter, just watched from a distance, took down license plate numbers, studied their comings and goings. Then came the liquor store where the group often gathered. Abraham sat at the far end of the bar, sipping one bottle of Miller Lite for 3 hours, just to memorize how one of the men, the one who had once jumped onto Joshua's car hood, walked with a slight drag in his left leg from an old injury. He asked no one, left no trace, only observed. Abraham had once planned the assault mission for Operation Silent Cross in Syria, where he had to lead a team through 9 kilometers of mountainous terrain, neutralize 3 resistance nests, and rescue a hostage bound in a cave. This time, the terrain wasn't a Middle Eastern war zone. It was Lockridge, Georgia. But he knew the enemies here were more subtle. They lived within the law, using the phrase community protection to legalize hatred. And now, Abraham was no longer a bystander. He wouldn't use bullets, but he would use every skill he had. And this time, the enemy wouldn't know they were being hunted until it was too late. At night, Lockridge looked like the perfect shell, calm, quiet, but breathing out through its cracks a toxic vapor that spread in silence. Abraham knew it well. The enemy was no longer just a few drunken fools. They had structure, they had networks, and they had a plan. He needed a weak link, and Benny Slade was the first crack in the chain. Benny was only 23. Small-built with reddish hair, he had gone to the same school as Joshua before dropping out in 10th grade after a fight with the PE teacher, a black man. He was the youngest in the group that had once surrounded the siblings' car at Hanson's gas station, and Abraham had noticed from the beginning that Benny was always the one scanning the surroundings first, not laughing loudly like the rest. A follower, strong only in a pack, the easiest kind to isolate. After 2 weeks of surveillance, Abraham chose a moonless night, temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Benny had a habit of sneaking out close to midnight, heading to an abandoned chicken coop behind an old farm to smoke and mess around with leftover beer cans. It was there, at 12:17 a.m., that Abraham subdued him in under 8 seconds. No sound, no wasted movement. Benny awoke with his wrists and ankles bound by thick paracord tied to a rusted iron chair. The coop was cold, wind howling through the cracks like a ghostly whisper. In front of him sat a man, perfectly still, arms crossed, no flashlight, no knife, no gun, only coal-black eyes watching him. "Benny," Abraham said for the first time after 10 minutes of silence. Benny flinched. I don't know anything. I didn't shoot her. Abraham said nothing, just remained silent. Silent enough that Benny's heartbeat began thudding in his ears like a drum. The fear didn't come from the pain. It came from not knowing when it would arrive. Benny began to talk. He didn't need to be threatened. Just the presence of a man who had once stood unfazed in the deserts of Ramadi was enough. "Hawk," Benny panted. "He let us. His real name is Richard Hawthorne. Former Marine, dishonorably discharged in 2008 for assaulting a black officer. He started a group, The Root, secretive, but spreading. About 60 members, scattered across southern Georgia counties. Ware, Coffee, Lanier. There's even a zone map. They're stockpiling weapons, all kinds. AR-15s, Remingtons, even explosives. Hawk says we're the shield of white America. He believes a day of great cleansing is coming, and the route needs to be ready." Abraham nodded slightly. He'd heard of paramilitary groups before, but this time he might be staring directly into a nest of venom about to rupture in the heart of America. Before leaving, Abraham left Benny tied up, accompanied by a whisper sharp as steel. "If you warn them, I'll come back. And next time, it won't be silent." 3 days later, precisely at 2:41 a.m., a warehouse on the outskirts of Millen in Jenkins County, identified by Abraham as one of the Root's ammo stockpiles, erupted in a blast loud enough to rattle the whole small town. Abraham left nothing behind, except a 2-minute video sent to 17 different newsrooms across Georgia, along with a direct copy to the FBI. The footage, filmed from a distance with his face concealed, showed him entering the warehouse, recording crates of ammunition, a logo reading Southern Resurrection, the Root's offspring, and a training manual dense with images of racial hatred. Then the camera panned toward the door, and a clear voice rang out. "They killed Joshua, but they didn't know. I was trained to uproot networks like this." And right then, flames roared up behind him, like the closing strike of a battle. The Root was no longer a secret. Lockridge was still asleep. But a hidden war had begun, not with guns or legal authority, but with a man who had returned from the shadows. And he was carrying justice. Not the kind with handcuffs, but the kind that waits, strikes, and never forgives. In a remote rural stretch of Lanier County, where satellite maps still hadn't caught up with road names, a strange gathering unfolded in the night. Across nearly 6 acres of open field, beneath the flickering glow of torchlights fixed to wooden stakes, more than 50 men, mostly white, wearing military caps and armbands with tilted crosses, assembled as if for a ritual. Some waved Confederate flags, some held M4 rifles, and all fell silent when one man stepped onto a makeshift wooden platform. He was Hawk, Richard Hawthorne. His voice was low and hard as stone. "We are the final bastion. When the government kneels, when the law grows weak, it falls on us to redefine what America means." Cheers erupted below. The crowd surged like it had been dosed with a hit of racial adrenaline. Someone held up a banner. "Protect white blood." Another shouted. Lockridge was just the start. Valdosta's next, then Atlanta. But among the crowd, one man didn't cheer, didn't smile, didn't drink. His eyes tracked Hawk's every movement, every man standing near him. It was Abraham, wearing a faded hoodie, cap pulled low, holding an empty soda can, as silent as a shadow. Half a mile away, on the crest of the western hill, Another man lay prone behind a cover of dried grass. His hands gripped a Barrett MRAD fitted with night optics, eyes locked onto the red dot centered on the speaker's audio rig. It was Zeke Rowland, Abraham's former teammate, who had once survived 72 hours with him under ISIL fire in Niger. Zeke had left the military, but for Abraham, the call came through blood. And Zeke had never said no. At precisely 9:08 p.m., a flare shot into the sky from the southern edge of the field. Its bright light drew everyone's eyes upward, and in that moment, Abraham moved. The first man, guarding the eastern flank, only had time to feel an arm wrap around his throat and twist. It didn't break his neck, just knocked him unconscious in 4 seconds. The second, holding a Mossberg shotgun, was dropped by a sweeping kick to the knee, followed by a strike to the carotid artery, enough to knock him out without endangering his life. Abraham didn't use a gun. Every blow was calculated with battlefield precision. Swift, clean, absolute. Within 2 minutes, 6 men were down, and no one knew what had happened. Screams rang out. Flashlights darted wildly. Hawk lost control. He shouted, "We've got a mole! Secure the perimeter!" Moments later, the giant screen in the center of the camp, originally set to display propaganda clips, suddenly switched images. A video began live streaming. The camera, from a high angle, captured the crowd cheering. Hawk's speech, every weapon, every face. Then came the takedowns, men collapsing one by one, no gunfire, only the moving shadow of a man acting like a surgical machine. A line appeared at the end of the footage. "These are not heroes. This is the true face of armed cowardice. Joshua will not be forgotten." The live stream was simultaneously broadcast to 4 platforms: YouTube, X, Facebook, and an extremist right-wing forum, the very one Hawk had used for recruitment. In less than 24 hours, the video reached 12.3 million views and was shared by both CNN and independent journalists investigating domestic extremism. Hawk, realizing his face had been exposed, fled the gathering. He dropped the microphone and retreated toward the forest's edge, along a trail known only to the leadership circle. But before disappearing, Hawk looked back. 3 days after the mysterious attack at the Roots training camp, a new video was uploaded from an anonymous account. No background music, no effects, just the truth, captured by a hidden camera. In the video, Sheriff Roland Clegg, the man who had once called Joshua's death mutual combat, appeared in full view. The clip lasted 2 minutes and 37 seconds. In it, Clegg, in uniform, but without his badge, was seen shaking hands with Hawk at an abandoned warehouse on the eastern edge of Lockridge. The two laughed heartily, clinking beer cans. Hawk said, "We cleaned up the mess at the gas station. You can relax." Clegg clapped him on the back, laughing. "As long as there are no cameras, I'll always be the guy who saw nothing." Immediately after, Clegg was heard saying, "Joshua should have known when to stay quiet. You did the right thing." The video ended with a still frame, Clegg's hand resting on Hawk's shoulder, under the yellow light shining directly onto the sheriff's insignia on his chest. No commentary, no dramatic edits. The image alone was enough to send a chill down viewers' spines. Within just 8 hours of its release, the hashtag number Justice for Joshua climbed to the top 3 trending topics on Twitter nationwide. MSNBC and CNN replayed the footage hourly. Civil rights lawyers, from Brian Stevenson to Dr. Rashida Greer, spoke out in unison. This is no longer the story of one town. This is evidence of a decaying system that has allowed hatred to thrive. The next morning, nearly 2,000 people poured into Lockridge. They brought handwritten signs. "Joshua deserved to live. We will fight in her place." A march of people in black shirts bearing Joshua's image raised their hands and walked in silence to the city hall. That scene, solemn, without chants or slogans, froze every camera lens on the street. At the same time, the Georgia State Supreme Court announced the launch of a special investigation under Article 6, Section 3 of the state constitution. Misconduct by public officials. The FBI also opened a case, deploying a task force specializing in racially motivated federal crimes. And then, at 3 p.m., the unthinkable happened. Sheriff Roland Clark, expressionless, still in uniform, walked out the doors of City Hall and was handcuffed by 2 of his officers in front of the public. The one who fastened the cuffs was Lieutenant Paula Sims, the same officer Clegg had once threatened to reassign for protesting the release of the Roots members. As Clegg passed through the line of protesters, no one laughed, but there was applause, hundreds of hands clapping, not in sync like an excited crowd, but like a declaration. We saw, and this time we did not look away. Beneath Lockridge's overcast sky, a child held up a cardboard sign scribbled in marker. My mom said, "Don't let Miss Joshua die twice." That evening, as news anchors lined up across every channel, from Fox to MSNBC, one question echoed through every broadcast. Who was behind these videos? Some said it was a hacker. Others believed the FBI had planted someone early on. But the people of Lockridge, those who had seen a quiet man stand in the crowd and then vanish, whispered his name, Abraham. But he didn't appear. He didn't stand among the crowd. He didn't take credit. He didn't speak on television. He only watched from afar, sometimes from the rooftop of an abandoned house, sometimes from a license plateless truck parked across the street. Because he knew, real victory isn't found in the spotlight. It's in the moment justice begins to shift. Lockridge had changed, at least in the eyes of the world, but Abraham hadn't stopped, because he knew Hawk was still alive, and the shadow of hatred doesn't vanish with just one arrest. The battle ahead would no longer be the community's. It would be his, and his alone. On the night of June 12th, deep within a dense pine forest nearly 50 miles from Lockridge, Abraham advanced alone toward the secret training camp known as the Root, a place white supremacist zealots considered a sacred ground to defend America from what they called the Colored Plague. There was no map, no outside support, only the guidance of instinct, military memory, and a fury that had never cooled. The camp was surrounded by 3 layers of barbed wire fences, each over 9 feet high, interwoven with crude but effective sensor systems. Bells, wooden traps, and warning lines scattered along the paths. Inside, according to intel from Benny Slade, were 60 armed men, 12 of whom were former soldiers dishonorably discharged for extremist and violent behavior. These were not amateurs. They were fighters, eager for an excuse to pull the trigger. Abraham began at 1:23 a.m., dressed in sand-colored combat gear, a backpack on his back containing only 3 things: binding rope, a recording device, and a slip of paper bearing a line Joshua once wrote on her mirror. Justice does not arrive through bullets, but it never comes if no one acts. He disabled the first guard post using a high-frequency pulse device that jammed their radios. The second was distracted by a homemade smoke grenade crafted from potassium and sugar, producing a thick white fog that lasted nearly 45 seconds, enough for Abraham to slip inside like a shadow. The third guard post, manned by someone carrying an M249 and overseeing automated floodlights, was approached from above. Abraham crawled across a decaying tree trunk, dropped down, and locked in a chokehold for 4 seconds, rendering the guard unconscious without triggering any alert. When he reached the center of the camp, a U-shaped wooden structure flying the Southern Resurrection flag atop a steel pole, Abraham saw Hawk. The man stood in the yard, still preaching to nearly 20 of his subordinates, who were still awake. His voice remained firm. The day we must offer blood will come. But before that, we must eliminate those who carry the infection. Tonight, we take the blood oath. No one in the crowd knew that Abraham had already activated a chest-mounted camera, live streaming to a secure server. Every image, every word was recorded. Undeniable. Walking into the center of the yard, Abraham carried no weapon. He was calm, silent. At first, the crowd assumed he was one of their own, but Hawk did not. He froze. His face turned pale. He remembered those eyes, the eyes of the man who had once stepped out of the dark and brought down 6 men without a single gunshot. "You fools!" Hawk screamed. "He's the brother of that girl who died in Lockridge. Shoot!" But before the shout finished, a loud explosion erupted, not from a firearm, but from the direction of the armory. A controlled detonation had been remotely triggered by Abraham via a timed signal. The crowd panicked. Smoke billowed thickly. Abraham charged. One elbow strike dropped the man to his left. A spin sent another, armed with a stun baton, crashing into a pile of chairs. Hawk drew a knife, but Abraham kicked it away. They grappled in the rain of ash, amidst screams and chaos, amidst the unraveling hysteria of those who once believed themselves invincible. And finally, Abraham subdued him. The rope tightened around Hawk's wrists. His face was bloodied, shirt torn, eyes wide with fear. Abraham said nothing for several minutes. Only when the camera zoomed in on Hawk's face did he speak, low, cold, like stone pressing down on the chest. "You're not a warrior. You're the kind who leads others into the slaughterhouse. You hide behind their blood to feed your delusions." Hawk hissed, "You're a traitor." Abraham stepped closer. "If standing for justice makes me a traitor, I'm ready to die on this soil." He turned to the camera. For the first time since the journey began, he looked directly into the lens. "My name is Abraham, former Delta Force commander. I didn't kill him. I didn't take revenge. I brought him into the light. 48 hours after the video of Hawk's capture went viral globally, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia announced the indictment of the extremist leader on 11 counts related to domestic terrorism, armed conspiracy, and inciting racial hatred. His real name, Kenneth Hawk Dobbins, was publicly revealed, along with a criminal record dating back to 2007, previously evaluated for psychiatric instability and dishonorably discharged from the Marine Corps for acts of extreme violence. After 4 consecutive hearings, Hawk was officially sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. At the same time, 6 core members of the Root training camp were convicted of armed riot conspiracy and unlawful weapons possession, including 2 former Iraq war veterans who were stripped of all military benefits. In total, 22 automatic weapons, 4,800 rounds of ammunition, and several improvised explosive devices were seized. Irrefutable evidence, all traced back to the footage Abraham had captured. In Lockridge, Sheriff Roland Clogg faced 3 federal charges: aiding and abetting criminal activity, facilitating terrorism, and abuse of power. When the trial opened, hundreds who had once remained silent stood outside the Lockridge County Courthouse, raising hand-painted signs. Joshua deserved to live. Abraham deserved to be heard. We deserve to be protected. The media tried to interview Abraham. CNN, the New York Times, and even CBS searched, but no one could find him. He vanished. Zeke, former sniper and Abraham's old teammate, was the last to hear from him. In the rusted mailbox outside a cabin on the hill, he found a single note, handwritten in light blue ink. "I did it her way. Not for revenge, but to stop another child from learning through blood. Keep silent for me. Zeke folded the letter, kept it like a relic, a wordless command. He spoke to no reporters, shared no stories. Because he knew, Abraham didn't need to be known. He needed justice to be remembered. The following month, at Lockridge South High School, where Joshua once taught social studies, an 8-meter mural was completed by her students. They painted her standing at the front of the classroom, curly hair, eyes ablaze, with a chalkboard behind her bearing the words in white chalk. She spoke up first and never stopped. At the bottom, a quote from Joshua's journal. "Justice is not a courtroom verdict. It is the refusal to let wrong outlive truth." The town of Lockridge began to change. A black woman, Elise Graham, was elected acting sheriff. Former police officers were placed under investigation. The Georgia State Department of Education launched a social justice curriculum, starting in Lockridge, extending to 52 high schools statewide. But within that town, people still occasionally spotted a figure in a baseball cap walking down Main Street at sunrise. No one was certain who it was. Only Mary Lou, the cafe owner, said, "Once, I saw him leave a white daisy on the doorstep." No words, just a greeting. The story of Joshua and Abraham spread across America like a call to conscience. No ornate speeches, no tearful declarations. Just one simple truth. Evil survives when good people hesitate to rise. But when one person steps forward, everything begins to shift. Justice doesn't come from a verdict. It comes from those who refuse to let silence be the final legacy of the fallen. Abraham didn't seek glory, because to him, the name Joshua was the greatest honor he ever had. And at last, something had begun to change. Join us in sharing more powerful stories by liking, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell, so each morning starts with reflection, courage, and human empathy.